Word. Thank you again, listeners, for tuning in from wherever you're tuning in from. We'll keep it pretty short today. We're going to talk about a cool and interesting topic. With the introduction of an RD page, Thorla, to our company, we have a lot of cool things that we've been able to do and implement into just the fabric of P2. And so, funny enough, the topic of peak week and peak week protocols, as Paige was peaking one of her clients, just kind of came up in conversation. And so Bryce and I kind of had some like back end conversation about it. And we're like, you know what, this is actually a pretty interesting topic. It will probably be pretty niche in its reception, obviously, as we're talking to competitors, but just kind of give you like an inside look on what we take into consideration, what our thought process is, what our main goals are with our clients as we are, counting down those single digit days, to the stage.
Yeah, I can kind of go ahead and start the conversation just by differentiating between a peak week for a physique sport and a quote unquote peak week for a performance-based sport. So for the latter, if we're talking about peaking for a powerlifting competition or peaking for an athletic event like a CrossFit competition or a game, if you're going into like a football game or something like that. So peaking for those performance-based athletic events is very different, almost diametrically opposed to peaking for a physique-based event. If you're peaking for performance, obviously your aesthetics don't matter. No one's judging you on what you look like. The only aspect of that where the aesthetics to a almost tangential degree will matter is if you are trying to make weight for a weight class. But even then, it's not what you look like. It's just, again, your body weight. So you're having to regulate things beyond just your performance-based metrics. So discounting that, going back over into physique peaking, the goal has nothing to do with how strong you are, how powerful you are, how fast you are, how much weight you can lift, how much you can, or how far you can throw a rock, right? Like it has nothing to do with any of that shit. So you can be as weak, as fragile, as depleted, as zombified as you need to be on stage, as long as you look at your best. So I wanted to create that spectrum there and that differentiation before jumping into talking about like how we approach peaking for physique sports, because it is just so different. And typically people will use the term taper whenever it's talking about something like going into a powerlifting competition, or sometimes they'll literally say deload before going into an athletic based event. But obviously, whenever we're talking about bodybuilding, we use those terms in a slightly different way. So again, just wanted to lay that out there before we start talking about peaking for physique sports. Right now that we've got that out of the way, I actually want to kind of like reverse and talk about going into a prep and how that leads into a peak week, because laying that groundwork, that foundation is important to be able to even get to the peak week and discuss what to do in a peak week. Depending on how long your prep is, sometimes people are going to be lucky enough to be able to get lean in 12 weeks. For most people, it's going to be 20 weeks plus, right? Like we're looking at very long preps. And with that, what we like to do is we like to break training into blocks. So each block can have its own sub goal, and within the macro goal of getting lean for this competition, right? So that is encompassing the entire prep. And again, if it's 20 weeks, that means that your macro cycle is going to be about 20 weeks long. And we can break that up into about 5 weeks, 5-week blocks. So 4 5-week blocks, depending on if we want to count the peak week as at the end of the last block, or if we want to kind of count that as its own thing. But anyway, I'm very big on approaching this from the perspective of the first block of a prep is basically a continuation of the off season. You're easing into the habits of a prep, but training does not need to change that much. If you're 16 plus weeks out, even 12 weeks plus out, training doesn't really need to change that much, because you should not be destroyed. You shouldn't be compromised. You should still be relatively strong, functional. Your cardio shouldn't be at such a degree where it's impacting your training. Your supplements shouldn't be crippling you at that point. Again, talking about PEDs here. And your diet should still be providing you with enough carbohydrates, enough fat, enough calories in general to be able to support your training, and then also allow you to recover from training as well. once we start getting to a certain degree of leanness, training will absolutely have to change. And with that, you have to be very, very deliberate about fatigue reduction strategies. So this is something that not a lot of people will intuitively understand about a prep, because a prep feels like you are pedal to the metal the entire time. It feels like there is no way and no time or opportunity to let up, otherwise you fall behind. But we take a different approach. Like, we still implement deloads during a prep. So again, that's why we talk about breaking a prep that is 20 weeks or whatever into sub goals, because you want to still allow your body time to recover and to drop fatigue as you're going through a prep. Because as cardio goes up, as calories come down, your ability to wash away fatigue is going to be very compromised. So your fatigue is going to start adding up faster and faster and faster. So you have to be more aggressive with doing things like deloads at a regular interval during your prep. So again, we are very in favor of taking like full deload weeks, even at 8 weeks out. And again, that might feel counterintuitive, might feel like the opposite of what you want to be doing at 8 weeks out, but it is bolstering the macro goal of getting to the stage as lean as possible in a semi-functional state. And not even that, but like, you want to be able to train hard and with enough volume as long as you can through your prep. So if you redline yourself for 15 weeks and you get to be 5 weeks out and you're just so fucked up, you're so depleted, you're so destroyed, you're so burnt out, that the last 5 weeks of your prep is training basically at an absolute minimal intensity with barely enough volume to make a dent in what you need to be doing, that's shit training. Like you're going to fuck yourself. You're going to atrophy. You're going to lose muscle. You're going to come in looking like trash. So we don't want to do that. So as we start getting closer to peak week, our training needs to be more specific. So as you get to be 12 weeks out, as you get to be about 8 weeks out, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, training should be migrating slowly and then faster. It's going to pick up speed faster towards specificity. And what I mean by specificity is obviously whatever your division is being graded on. So let's use bikini division as an example. Delts, glutes, pretty much the main things that they're being graded on. Obviously, a tight midsection, obviously a certain degree of leanness, presentation, posing, those come into play. But that's not really what we're after here. But we want to be maximizing what the division is judging for. Delts, glutes primarily for something like bikini division. So that means our training is going to have to build around maximizing those things. Another counterintuitive point, that does not mean add more for delts and glutes. So that is another quick way to absolutely fuck yourself and prevent you from looking your best on stage. If you think that prioritizing your training exclusively means adding more, then you have it backwards. Sometimes it means doing less. And again, that is very counterintuitive. Or sometimes it means bringing the rest of your training down to a maintenance level and holding the volume and intensity of what you're trying to prioritize stable. So again, maybe with a bikini athlete, you pull arm volume, you pull quad volume, you pull pec volume, back training volume down to a level of volume and a level of intensity that is just meant to maintain the functionality and musculature there. And then you can still train your delts and your glutes hard as fuck with more volume than your other muscles would be able to take on. But again, it might not be adding more in the more conceptual sense that we tend to think about that. All right, so I'm going to speed run this now because this is taking a little bit long, but I wanted to frame all of that in a way that like makes sense to people that are listening, because it might not all make too much sense. Okay, so in conjunction with all of that I'm saying there, the exercise selection that you choose has to transition over the course of a prep towards safer exercises. If you start your prep at 20 weeks out and you're doing, heavy barbell RDLs, heavy barbell squats, bent over rows, you're doing standing overhead presses, by the end of prep, let's say 2 weeks out, you might be doing exclusively hyperextensions, exclusively leg press, exclusively machine overhead press, exclusively chest supported rows. And the reason for that is like what we talked about a second ago. Your fatigue is going to be so high by that point, no matter what you do in terms of deloads, in terms of training, in terms of diet breaks. Your fatigue is going to be very high because of the cardio that you're presumptively doing and the leanness level that you're presumptively at. So no matter what you do, you're just going to be more vulnerable in physical sense. So we want to make sure that we do everything that we can from an exercise selection standpoint to mitigate the risk of injury. Because, as we always say, it doesn't fucking matter what you do if you get hurt a week before you're supposed to step on stage, then all of it is flushed down the drain. Doesn't fucking matter. So once we have all of those bases covered, we can get into actual peak week. Okay. So typically what we like to do, what I like to do is I like to take that 2 week out mark and really bring the intensity down. So the volume can stay about the same level, but the intensity will come way down. Typically, nothing is taken close to fail, or nothing is taken to failure. Maybe accessories or 1, 2 RIR, but anything that is compound, anything that is going to be more fatiguing or quote unquote dangerous to the athlete is going to be like 6 RPE, right? Like 6 RPE, 4 RIR, like very, very far away from failure, but we're going to be focusing on getting the most out of those movements with the volume that we have, with the load that we're using. So, and then as we get into actual peak week, so let's just say, 6, 7 days out, then we really scale back on the volume, really scale back. And it's exclusively moved over to exercises that, for the most part, eliminate extreme stretches and eliminate the possibility of muscle damage within that. Because as we're in peak week, we're not only trying to reduce fatigue, we're not only trying to align the training with whatever the nutrition strategy is, whether that is depletion or, carving back up, because that has to align there as well. But we want to make sure that we are reducing inflammation. So that is going to be a very, very important point, is if you are very inflamed, which I'm sure everybody can understand here, you're going to hold water. You're not going to be looking your best if you're inflamed. So muscle damage creates local inflammation. If you, for example, fuck up your quads 5 days out from your show, but let's just think about this as a bodybuilder, right? Male bodybuilder who is being judged on their quad separation, their quad conditioning. You fuck up your quads 5 days out doing hack squats with a very deep stretch, that's going to be clouding the separation and conditioning in your quads because they're going to be inflamed. You're not going to be able to flex them very hard. So we want to eliminate as much of that muscle damage and the accompanying inflammation as we can. So again, going towards exercises that are mostly going to be training like the middle range of motion, but also this is extremely, extremely important, using exercises that are not novel to that athlete. So I tend to use exercises that have already been in the programming for the last 4, 6, 8 weeks. So that's what we kind of pull from. We don't introduce anything new during peak week. We just reduce the volume, we reduce the intensity, maybe we reduce the rest periods and just keep them moving, but we're not chasing the pump necessarily. And I think that that's another misinterpretation that people have with peak weeks, is they go in there and they do circuits of everything. They do triceps, supersets, and they do sets of 30 with bicep curls, tricep extensions, leg curls. They just do high reps, very minimal rest. But that's actually not what you need to be doing, right? The day before, if you just want to do a full body circuit just to burn up some glycogen, okay, sure. But your training does not need to be like that. It should not be like that. What you're doing is you're just easing yourself into the show. That's really all you're doing. The diet should be carrying 95% of the load through your peak week. Again, if you want to just go in there and get blood flow, sure, great, do that. Go ahead and do it. But it is not going to be that important in terms of your depletion and then carving back up. And I think that a lot of people put way too much emphasis on what training is going to be capable of doing during peak week. It can do some damage. It can have negative consequences, but the benefits of even perfect training during peak week are probably not going to be what most people think that they're going to be. That kind of lends itself to more of a theme where training is a longer term consequence of doing good things with good habits, whereas nutrition can be more short term. And then going into peak week, or excuse me, going into the show, obviously backstage, you can do stuff like pumping up, which does help. So that is where you can actually make a good difference if you pump the correct muscles. And this can probably be a completely different conversation. But in terms of your presentation, a cheap presentation, everybody knows if you get a really sexy pump, it's going to show. It's going to show. But you want to make sure that you're pumping the right muscles because, again, that is extremely important to do. And not every muscle has the same weight as, for example, pumping your side delts. Side delts can be very pronounced, but if you go and pump up your glutes, it's not going to have the same effect. It just won't. Like that will not have the same visual effect as getting a gigantic pump and a lot of blood into your side delts. So anything that you want to add, Chris? Because I know that I just talked for 10 minutes, and we're not going to have too much time.
Yeah, no, that was good. I think that was really good. I was wondering if it was going to turn into a conversation or like an education, like just like monologue. But I think that there are pieces of that or the way that was handled, I think was good, because sometimes I'm sure that in our loquaciousness, people can probably lose some of the context. And so you're able to kind of like lay criteria, rubrics, and then also just any, prerequisite information people should understand prior to the process. I wrote down a couple of things. So I thought it was interesting. I wanted to draw special attention to the idea of a deload and what a deload may look like in off season versus a prep. And then what signals of I need a deload might look like in an off season or a prep, which I think is interesting, right? So I think that in off season, when you have plenty of time, a prep on the horizon, or it's deep on the horizon, you play with it a little bit. You're a little bit more risky, right? You're like, let's earn it, right? Let's earn the deload. Like, go ahead and cripple yourself this week, because next week I don't want you to train at all, or next week I only want you walking and maybe doing some light kind of circuit style stuff. Whereas in prep, far less likely to do that, especially like you said in 15 sub weeks, 15, 12, because you run into the issue of like, well, what if we fuck ourselves up and we're out of the gym for like 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, right? So you are a bit more conservative with the biofeedback. When you're seeing those symptoms, that fatigue start to rise, you're probably going to call it sooner. You're not going to run them into the ground because you're like, nah, just not worth it, right? So let's just go ahead and pull back this week, pull back on volume, back on intensity, and kind of rinse, wash, repeat with a new or similar but adjusted design. And of course, as you get closer and closer and closer, you get more and more conservative, and the deloads might look a little different as well. Junk volume, right? The idea of quote unquote junk volume and how that changes, right? Because when you have a lot of volume, when people are training, 1.5 to 2.5 hours a day, 5 days a week, off season, having lots of fun, like, fuck it, let's do everything we can, right? Let's continue to prioritize our opportunity groups, the things that we may have gotten notes on from our previous season. And also, like, we can holistically continue to get better as an athlete, as a bodybuilder, so on and so forth. But like you said, the scope of what junk volume is changes the closer and closer you get to prep, as you have to prioritize the volume, as you have to prioritize the things you're willing to risk that fatigue accumulation for. So you're like, hey, yeah, maybe we don't need to worry about pec flies. Maybe we don't need to worry about goblet squats. And let's focus on our RDLs. Let's focus on our machine laterals. And we get pushback sometimes with clients with, well, I feel like I'm not doing. I'm like, you're right, we're not. And we understand that might come at a quote unquote cost, but like, what's the trade? The trade is you are going to be more exhausted, you're going to be more fatigued, we're going to generate more inflammation, we're going to need more time to recover. And we're also working on depleted macros, depleted caloric intakes. So the ability to recover is not there, or at least in the capacity that we're used to. So it's a very good thing for people to understand, like, yeah, 20 weeks ago, sure, let's load up and we want to do this, triceps, this, that. But now that's changed, and it's important to recognize the phasic nature of that and how it can change even the relatively concrete parameters or training variables that we try to work within the framework of. That scope of them change based on where we are and where our goals are at that moment. Lastly, I think that was cool. Like, you kind of just touched on like main goals, and I think it might be good for you to revisit like overarching main goals of prep. I think you talked about them a lot in the peak week. I think you talked about a lot in like the context without just like the overarching. I'm looking at this, and this, and safety is obviously a huge piece. You mentioned that, like, hey, like best ability is availability, right? Like we can look great, but if you're laying in bed and you can't contract your core because you threw your back out, like, it doesn't really do us a whole lot of good. So there's a couple of things that I think I added that I want to give context. Things I agree with you in the way that, hey, heavy resistance training, traveling, the deepest ranges of motion, the most compromised and possibly disadvantaged parts of a movement are probably not great to focus on. I do like to focus on maintaining full ranges of motion on very conservative movement patterns, especially in like the beginning or end of a session where it's like, hey, like I know you're fatigued, so you can't even try to go heavy here, even if your brain is telling you to do something stupid. And I'm like, no, you can't, because I understand the level of just susceptibility that you're at. And the last thing I want you to be doing is walking up the stairs with groceries and turning funny because you haven't been moving a certain way. And I think about implementing training now that protects you outside of the gym as well, not just inside of the gym, and making sure that you maintain conscious awareness of your mobility and conscious awareness of what is and isn't safe to do, and also keeping those ranges as broad as possible for everyday life. Personally, like it's probably a more of a internal bias that I have as a former like field athlete and then also a bodybuilder. I think about all the times I got hurt, and most of the time it was not on the field and not in the gym. It was doing something fucking silly because I hadn't been doing the things I needed to do on the field or in the gym. So just wanted to kind of give my thought on that, and then obviously pitch it back to you and see what your thoughts are. Also, chasing a pump in peak week when you're depleted and you don't have any fucking glycogen in your muscles is probably just futile, because even if you do get it, it's like, what's it worth? But also keep in mind that a pump, again, is heavily at that point diet related, and if you don't have the fucking carbs, like there's a good chance you won't get what you want.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with what is the goal of peak week. Okay, so the goal of peak week is to support the diet. That's what the goal of peak week training is. It's to support the nutrition, support the changes in hydration, support the changes in supplementation. Again, if we're talking about enhanced athletes, because that is a gigantic component of what is happening the last couple of weeks. It's changes in PED uses or supplementation uses, or water intake or electrolyte intake or carbohydrate intake, right? And all of these are meant to allow you and allow your body to go through rapid changes in terms of water compartmentalization, and then also your glycogen storages, right? So you're not burning any additional body fat. Typically, again, let's just zoom it over to like a natural athlete. You're not burning any additional body fat the last week. It's just not happening. All you're doing is you're trying to make very subtle adjustments to where you're storing the most, essentially water, right? Because even with glycogen, it's pulling water into the muscles. So it's basically all just fluid retention. But that's an important aspect here, is if you look at someone's peak week diet, typically it will look like a depletion in carbohydrates and a carbing back up process. And with that, there will be changes to hydration, to electrolytes as well, to support that depletion and carbing back up process. What I want to say here is most people think incorrectly that the purpose of training during the depletion process is to burn intramuscular glycogen stores. I'm here to tell you that no matter what the fuck you do with training, if you're eating 25 grams of carbs a day, you existing is depleting your intramuscular glycogen stores. You don't have to do anything in the gym, right? You don't have to go in and do 5 circuits of arm work to deplete your biceps and triceps of glycogen. You just don't have to do it, right? So that's why we take an ultra conservative approach to peak week training, is because you don't really have to fucking do anything to effectively deplete your glycogen stores. You really don't, especially if you're eating very low carbohydrates. And if that has been a continual process, right? Of course, if you're eating 500 grams of carbs and you drop down to 50, the moment of peak week, there's going to be some effect that has to just be burned off. Like, that's not going to be immediate. But, if you're someone who has been under 100 grams of carbs for the last 3 weeks, and then you deplete further during peak week, all right, you're good. You're good. Your body is going to burn that shit off. You probably don't even have any stores left at that point. Like you're running on fumes. Like half of these people are damn near in ketosis anyway. So it's like what is there left to burn inside of your muscles? Not much. So that's an important point. Because again, the main idea behind peak week training is supportive. It's a support role. So anyone who tries to do too much, you're basically counteracting what the goal of peak week training is meant to be. So don't try and do too much. Everything you do during prep in general, but especially during peak week, should be minimal dose. Try to get the most stimulus or the stimulus that is sufficient for the goal, and then fucking leave. Get out. Choose the exercises that are most effective at that, the volume that's the most effective, the percentage of your 1 rep max, the intensity as in terms of like, proximity to failure. All of those variables should be supportive of the goal, minimal effective dose for sufficient stimulus. And that's really it. And that kind of takes me into your junk volume point, which we could probably have an entire different episode talking about junk volume and how insidious that is as a failure point for a lot of people's training. But especially during prep, especially during peak week, like if you're going in there and doing unnecessary volume or volume that is not doing anything other than making you feel a bit happier about working hard, quote unquote, it's counteractive, it's counterproductive. You're actively harming your look on stage, right? So people that go in and train 6 days a week for 2 hours during prep because they think that is somehow doing better, you're fucking yourself. And this is another conversation that we probably have, but most people, whether they're off season or prep, would, in my opinion, be better served doing 4 times a week training, provided they know how to train hard enough to where they are able to even be competing in the first place, right? If you don't know how to train hard, you shouldn't be on stage. That's square one. We know that that's not always followed and adhered to because we've dealt with clients like this who come to us, they're like, I'm 6 weeks out, and they literally don't know how to train. Like you give them an RDL and they can't do an effective deadlift or hinge, and you're like, okay, well, what the fuck am I supposed to do? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I can't do anything. So that's a very important caveat, because if you can train with sufficient intensity and generate a stimulus, then you should be able to get enough and maximize that with 4 times a week. You should be able to. And if you want to add in like a fit day, then you should be consolidating your training on the other days, right? It should not be, I'm adding a fit day that's also 2 hours long, right? It should not be like that. And again, it's just kind of all feeds back into this idea of feeling like you have to do more because you're in prep, because there is an event coming up. And that basically is just all junk. It's just all junk. And if you're choosing exercises that are poor, and if you're continuing to do a lot of volume with exercises that don't really have a great stimulus to fatigue ratio anyway, then you're basically fucked from the get-go. Like there's really not much that you can do to come back from that. So that's why it is so important to nail your training. But again, it's like if we're talking about peak week, it's funny because peak week doesn't really matter unless you're doing everything wrong in terms of training, right? If you have some intuitive knowledge about like what you need to be doing and just go in there and just kind of go through the motions, get a pump, break a little sweat, and then leave, it doesn't really matter what you're doing inside of that 30, 45 minutes that you're in the gym. As long as you're not going in there and doing like barbell squats and barbell deadlifts, you're probably going to be okay. Again, that's more intuition. Your body should be telling you, hey, I can't really do those things effectively right now, so let's do something a little bit easier. And that is actually great biofeedback. You should listen to that during peak week. But what happens and what we see often is people fuck themselves 20 weeks out, 16 weeks out, 12 weeks out, because they're choosing the wrong exercises, they're choosing the wrong volumes, they're choosing the wrong frequencies that far out. And it's like, well, we can't really course correct at 4 weeks out. Like you've already set yourself so far behind. Now we're just in damage control for the next 8 weeks. Like I don't know what I'm supposed to do right now because you have been doing everything so wrong up until now. But zooming out, junk volume bad. deloads. All right, so the point of deloads is exclusively fatigue reduction during a prep. What we can do in off season is much more fluid. We can do things like bridges. So rather than a deload capping a current or previous training block and going through the same general movement patterns with just decreased volumes, decreased intensities, decreased loads, I sometimes will use bridges, and that bridge will effectively be the first week of the coming training block, but with lower intensities, lower volumes, lower loads. And it's allowing them to reduce their fatigue while still getting practice and getting accustomed to what's coming next. But that will have a slight cost in terms of not dropping fatigue as much as a normal deload would, where you're just doing the same exercises, just scaled back. So that's one thing we can do. Like you mentioned, a lot of times we'll build deloads around our clients' travel, around vacations that they have, around events, holidays. So it can be much more fluid, and it can be much more auto-regulated. So that's very important too. Whenever you have a lot of surplus calories and nutrients flowing around your body, you can extend progressions a little bit longer. Sometimes you might be but you just don't really need a deload. And we're like, all right, cool. Let's push this another week. Let's see what happens. Maybe you're still progressing in loads and volumes. And yeah, you're getting some biofeedback, but we can just kind of ignore that for the time being and just see what happens. We can keep pushing. You can be more aggressive during an off season. During a prep, you have to be extremely conservative with everything that you do, because again, dropping fatigue is the main goal, but also preservation is the main goal. You do not want to get injured. And if I could repeat that after every sentence of this podcast, I would do that, because during prep, you do not want to get hurt. Reduce risk of injury as much as you possibly can. And controlling your fatigue is the best way of doing that. So I will say that another aspect of this is the deloads that I tend to add in during prep are not auto-regulated. They are planned. So I don't care if my client is like, I'm still feeling good. I'm like, we're taking a deload. And it's not because I don't listen to my clients. It's because I know that during a prep, my clients tend to give me information that is not necessarily true, because they want to continue pushing. They want to feel like they're doing more. They don't want to take deloads because a deload feels to them like a backward step. And they know we're on a strict timeline. We cannot afford backward steps. So sometimes you have to mindfuck your clients. You just can't give them an option. Obviously, I will listen to their biofeedback. I will pay attention to what they're telling me. But we are on a strict schedule. And because we're on a strict schedule, I tend to plan deloads in no matter what. And I'm like, this is going to happen. So take advantage of the 4 to 5 weeks that you have of this training, maximize it, because on the other side of that, during this week, we are taking a deload, no matter what the fuck you say. It's happening because we have to control your fatigue. We have to. So they're not auto-regulated. So again, there are subtle differences there, but the goals are vastly different between off-season deloads and prep deloads. So that was another point. And then I'm trying to think of one of the other points that you made that I wanted to also touch on.
You talked junk volume. You talked difference in deloads, junk volume, and then I said I mentioned making sure that training still supported like everyday health as well. So like obviously like not training heavily in yoga.
So that's actually a great point. So I'm going to focus on bikini competitors for now, because this is an issue that we probably run into more than any other demographic. Is whenever a bikini athlete is going through a prep, posing is absolutely destructive to their physique. And I'm sure any other coach that's listening to this can relate. I'm sure any athlete can relate as well. If you are sufficiently focused on improving your posing, which because posing and presentation in the bikini division is so important, you have to pay as much attention to that aspect as you do your normal training, your cardio, your diet, because it doesn't matter how good you look. If you can't present it on stage, it's all for naught. It doesn't matter. So because posing is so important, you can basically expect 30 minutes of posing practice pretty much a day. Let's just call it that on average, especially as you get closer to the show and it's going to be more regular. You're going to be checking in more often. You're going to be, every single morning going through your routine. That is absolutely going to fuck your body up. And anyone who has never posed before, I encourage you to go through 5 minutes of posing, just 5 minutes, and see how you feel the next day. You will be fucked. Your low back will be killing you. Your upper back will be bothering you. You'll be so sore. And the reason for that is because even just holding those positions is unnatural, especially for bikini athletes. You are holding extremely unnatural positions, whether that is your front pose where you're twisting and opening up to a degree of contortion that is just absolutely fucking your low back, fucking your QL, fucking your SI joint up. And the problem is that most of these athletes only pose to one side, their better side. So they're repeatedly doing that to one side, and they're not doing anything to counteract that, right? And again, in training, we can only do so much. So it really does come down to the athlete to take that under their own responsibility and say, I need to counteract for all the damage I'm doing in posing. So whether that is mobility work, whether that's just general stretching, whether that is doing the opposite patterns to some low threshold, just to make sure that you're not developing really poor compensation patterns, you have to be doing that for posing. Absolutely have to be doing that. Because if you don't, posing will fuck your body up. It will really, really, really negatively impact you by the end. And again, if you don't believe me, just go ahead and do 2 months of posing every morning for 5 to 10 minutes, and you will start to understand what's going on. Not even that, but also let's just add in cardio, an hour of cardio or hour plus of cardio every single day. That does beat your body up a ton. If you're doing it on a Stairmaster, you can multiply that by 10. It's going to beat your body up. So that has to be counteracted in some capacity, which is another reason why the ab work that we do, as you get closer to your show, I tend to switch a little bit more towards like ab stability work, anti-rotation work. And I've had conversations with clients where they're like, this doesn't really feel like ab training because they're used to crunches, they're used to hanging leg raises, they're used to shit like that. And I'm like, it's okay. It's supposed to be supportive in a slightly different way. And another thing that I have a lot of my athletes do, pretty much all of them, is ab backing work. So typically around like 6 to 8 weeks out, I'll start recommending that my clients do some ab backing training. So abdominal control, working your transverse abdominis, making sure that you can suck, quote unquote, suck your abs in and hold that and control your abs. You have to be able to do that. And the more comfortable you can get with that, the better you'll be able to do that on stage and be able to hold that during your posing as well. And if you can really strengthen your TA, that will carry over into protecting you in the gym and also mitigating a lot of the negative effects of things like posing, things like tons of cardio every single day. Your TA muscle is basically your internal belt, your internal lifting belt. You can think of it like that. I know a lot of people use that cliche, but it is kind of true, right? It does really support everything else in your midsection. So you need to be able to train that. You need to be able to strengthen that. Doing something like 10 by 10 second holds of ab vacuums first thing in the morning and then right after you train as well, super helpful for being able to train that muscle up to where it is able to handle the intensity of posing on stage, but also just like the normal low grade intensity of everyday life, of walking for 90 minutes a day, of sitting in your desk chair, shit like that. Those are, I guess, some just like very high level recommendations, things that I tend to do. We were going to talk about week after peak week and how we tend to approach not week after peak week after show. But I don't think we're going to have time for that. Do you want to end on anything before we dip out of here?
Yeah. So I think that's a great topic for another podcast, another quick hitter, especially because we're like in high tide of the season. So for me, 2 things that I will leave the listeners with. One, you hit a really, really good point. I mentioned earlier in the conversation the idea of collaboration and working with our clients to really get them to take ownership of their training, have fun with it, especially deep in off season. Things like, hey, I really want to do this, or I'd love to, work on this, component of my physical ability, so on and so forth. I just really like doing ellipses insert is not a good enough reason for me as a coach to change anything inside of prep. When we are prepping and we are in that 15 sub, we get 10, 5 out, peak week. If you're like, well, I just really like, I don't care. I don't give a fuck. Sorry, I don't care. Like it doesn't matter. And I think that's really important.
I'll add that if someone is uncomfortable during an exercise, or if they feel like they're not able to do it and maximally get the stimulus that we're seeking out of it, I will change those things. I listen to those things. So just not to cut you off, an example that I always have is like belt squats. As someone gets leaner, the belt becomes more and more and more uncomfortable on their hip bones. So that's something that I have to converse back and forth with my clients as they get to 6, 5, 4, 3, 2 weeks out, because belt squats is one that I lean into heavily because of its wrist return, right? Because it's not actually loading, but you can push it really hard as a squat pattern. So that was just one example I thought of off the top of my head. But I do think that it's very important, because if you're a coach, you need to be having these conversations. You can't just give your client program at 16 weeks out and tell them to run to fucking peak week. Like, that shit pisses me off so much. Training has to be dynamic as the client's body is changing. So I lump prep, the post-prep period, recovery period, and pregnancy and postpartum into very similar dynamics in terms of how rapidly people's bodies are changing. You would not have a client go through pregnancy from first trimester all the way through labor. You would not have their training look the same, because their body is changing so fucking rapidly. And you wouldn't have them come out of postpartum jumping right back into what they fucking did before. Right? It makes no sense. Your body is different. Same thing with a prep and the recovery period after prep. It is so dynamic. It has to be tapered, has to be, gradiated. You have to understand what goes where. You have to understand how volume feeds into that, intensity, exercise selection, potentially intensity techniques as well. Like, you have to know where the fuck to use all of that shit. So that was just a point I wanted to make, because the parallels between those are so striking to me, because we have a lot of those types of clients that come through, and I've coached a lot of them before. And obviously I would not compare the burden of pregnancy to the burden of competing. Those are very different. But in terms of what is necessary from a training component and being able to think flexibly about training, they are similar.
Yeah, there's the disparity between the phases of each and how things need to change with those changes in the phase they're very, very parallel. I think you're talking more about discomfort, which I agree with you. Obviously, you want to make sure that you are listening to your clients and feel like this hurts, or this is uncomfortable.
You're talking just about like enjoyment.
Yeah, they're like, I just want to do this. This is fun. I'm like, I don't give a fuck. Like, I get it. Like, I care a lot more about your mental buy-in and the zeal you have about your training far out. But once we get to a point of, it's crucial, we're on a time crunch, like you said, I care far more about efficacy and safety. And also, I am, like you said, to mind fuck people. I am thinking, if you like doing something, there's a good chance you'll probably edge out the intensity because you enjoy it so much. So you'll put yourself in a fucked up position, and I'm just going to keep you from doing something to yourself that we will later regret. So that was one note. And then the last note, because obviously it's what it's all about, you mentioned posing. And I cannot stress this enough on my personal note, on a coach note. Posing symmetry is super fucking important. Obviously, you want to always show your best. So if you are strongest from your right, from your left, that is what you want to start with on stage, obviously. They will, of course, run you through all of your transitions, but the more you can show your strongest side, the better. Behind the scenes, posing symmetry and working on them in somewhat of an equilibrium keeps you safer, keeps you more balanced as far as just your structural anatomy and the consistent torsion it's being pulled into. And also, if you are a competitor who's competed more than once and in larger shows, there is a large chance you will eventually be put on the outside. And not because you are not doing well, but because just by natural, lining up, you are just ending up there. And there will be a judge way over there that cannot see you. And then you will outpose yourself. Like, you will push yourself out of the competition because they cannot see your physique on full display. And you see these people start to turn themselves sideways on the stage because they cannot pose from the other side. You are fucking yourself. You should be able to put on at least an applicably decent display from both sides. Obviously, always go with your strongest side, but if you are not posing on both sides, you are shooting yourself in both feet.
Agreed. Agreed. All right. On that note, we can wrap this up. You want to bring us home?
Obviously, we thank you all for, tuning in. Again, competition high tide. So for all the competitors out there, if you have questions, if you want to drop peak week stories, definitely hit us in the comment section of, YouTube, drop it in our Discord. If you're not in our Discord, you should join, and we'll see you next week.